Hello everyone, today we talk about the spiritual, civilizational, moral reaction in the meeting between the Roman Christian and Germanic worlds during the late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and in a broader universal sense, naturally revolving around the capacity of the empire to save the world through God, and therefore the most intimate continuity with the Catholic tradition and doctrine historically. This is actually a massive topic, just per se. I've never really talked too overtly about this specific connection, like how the Germanic peoples had this effect within the Roman Christian world, and say more in general what became in fact the Latin Germanic one. We talked a lot about the Romano-Germanic Imperial, we talked a lot about the say the Germanic world, mostly its warfare and the intertwinement that had already of course been going on with the same Rome for all the Germanic war bands that had served under the imperial banners. And the role of Christianity as well. We made lots of videos about the evangelization of the Germans. We highlighted the most important and radical difference between the Catholic tradition that the Germans had in their religion, their culture, in their worldview, and the what we call paganism. And so sort of the most deterior, fractal, in fact, relativistic and materialistic dimension that lived in the sort of subcultural humus of the Vodanic, was in fact Catholically the properly the imperial, the same imperial belief that the Romans had, and that in fact the Germanic elites had already been sharing since in the truest Indo-European worldview, and just more the truly ecumenic one existing, as we've seen also in recent videos about Far East Asia, like in parallel with all this and in obvious continuity with one another. It's a huge topic because I think it's also one of the single most misunderstood. I mean, most people don't conventionally understand even what I just said, right, in terms of what we mean by Catholic, what we mean by pagan. There are people who are fundamentally misreading the evangelization of Germanic peoples in a way that fundamentally revolves just around post-traditional, nationalistic, and socialistic. They're always together, and the fourth essay, they're 200 years old at most, beliefs that unfortunately are the last stage of subnormal degeneration of mankind, according properly to the Imperial Catholic tradition. And doctrinally speaking, what happened, however, during the evangelization of the Germans was incredible. We talked a lot about this in the videos about the Romano-Germanic world. We observed, of course, how the Germans managed to substitute themselves to the Roman military, keeping essentially to govern the Romance world. Aside from the shrinking of civilization, the general collapse and an emergential condition that both peoples lived. As a matter of fact, actually, those who lived in the Barbaricum had been probably the most prompted by the events to move, to risk everything, etc. And for this reason, developing and having already developed from their tribal militarized context, as we talk about in interest of average individual, this enormous task that was actually sustaining the empire. It was a counterculture, however, obviously present, as we pointed out before, with paganism as well, within the same Germanic world, within the same Roman world, that looked at sort of the doom, right, of mankind, saying it's over, right? The collapse of the world order has come. If the holy city of Rome basically cannot produce anymore children adequate to hold the rule of the entire world that basically the Germans themselves had fit under, because it doesn't matter whether they were directly or indirectly occupied. They were within the Roman sphere of influence. They had been managed by Rome for centuries in that sense. And they believed, and this is the most important thing, they believed they were within that, right? And from the Roman side, you have this increase in, first of all, an over-reliance on an ever more hypostatically conceived institution that, in fact, is distancing, really, from the reality, where most people essentially live as serfs, as colonists in somebody else's control. As we'll see, not really a different condition from even those nominal freemen that eventually, as Germans or other peoples, would settle within the same Romance world, and that sort of did go under. We will talk about the genesis of feudalism in part of this, because there's no doubt that there had been an exhaustion from all across the world, like from both sides. There is no such thing like, and first of all, it's wrong to consider the Roman Germanic opposition in the first place, right? It wasn't really a relation dictated in those terms. The racial divides did exist. Ideally, the Germans would have been simply the ones ruling over the Romans, but in many ways, if we've seen it in practically every Romano-Germanic context we have encountered, what happens after the conquest, the settlement, is aside from the already differentiated relations that existed between the Romans and the Germans, as we've seen in Ostrogothic Italy. I made a recent video, like the system of late antiquity had not collapsed, so basically things kept going, and they had already going with the Germans fundamentally framed as the soldiery, and the rest of the Roman population leaving, also very often without even seeing many of them, because they were normally settled in some more strategic militarized areas and business going as usual, into different other contexts in which the Germans came to rule, also in larger numbers, and essentially remolded a bit, like all the social structures that normally, however, had already been altered significantly. This is the case, in fact, of the same Italy after, let's say, after the Gothic War. So it's not much that the Longobards changed the picture, it's that the situation had already changed, actually favoring dramatically the later syncresis of the Romans and the Germans in Longobard Italy. It's the same in Britain. The Anglo-Saxons came in when the system had already collapsed from the within as a social issue. We do not know too much about it, but it was a pretty ugly thing behind that lack of documentation that we understand. And in general, in a couple of generations, the Romano-Germanic syncresis is evident pretty much elsewhere. The elites remain in charge in many areas, especially true in Gaul and in Spain, without, in particular, the Gallo-Roman ecclesiastical senatorial establishment. The Merovingian Empire could have properly not existed as we know it. There was also Clovis' genius of converting straight from what we say to Catholicism, other than Arianism, like the Goths, for example, had done. There is a lot to unpack behind that. I've already made multiple videos on the topic, but we'll have to come back on it more frequently. The problem of this all, however, is the one I've always posed when talking about this stuff. Like, there is a vast current of individuals nowadays that fundamentally see civilization as a threat. They see power as a threat. They look at empires and they're afraid of them, and or they essentially think that empire means a fixed categorical institutional form that existed in all history in the same way, regardless of what they instead hysterically and publicly escape properly to picture mentally, because that would highlight their failure as human beings. That is, of course, the level of degeneration from divinity. And the constant dimming of the sacred in the heart of man that produces every community to collapse and exhaust. The sense is this: like if there had been something oppositional, dualistic, antithetic, very often these people are also Gnostics. I mean, they believe that there is a huge part of the adult population that actually, I mean, and these are actually adult people, like, or at least they're supposed to believe that this struggle, say, between the Romans and the Germans, or whichever, between the sort of the free people and the terrible empire, was a Gnostic struggle, right? That Gnosticism is the great truth that the evil church has wanted essentially to obscure you, that there are essentially two powers. You basically lose any within. It's basically the same Protestant adage in many ways. The same Arianism presents some of those features that, aside from all the issues, of course, turning everything into a superstition where you are basically under these forces, you can't really do much in the first place. And you accept that there is a principle of evil that is active and not, according to the Imperial Catholic tradition shared by all Indo-European peoples, of course, the fact that there is either power or nothing. In other words, there is either life, truth, love, or nothing. And nothing means death. Well, nothing means you do not exist. It's much worse than, it's the nullification, the destruction of your existential right. And it's exclusively your fault all the time. That's why these people do not and cannot afford to hear the actual doctrine, because they would, of course, be unmasked for what they so miserably are. And it all together with the usual BS, like, I don't know, these people thinking that they are people from 2,000 years ago because they live, I don't know, as average morons in a 21st century society, without education, without beauty, without wisdom, without accomplishment, without anything. This is not what your ancestors believed in, right? Your ancestors would have thought of you as subhuman beings had they seen you, right? There is nothing statically, say biologically materialistic about you descending from these people and being better than them. It has nothing to do with that. Even if genetically that, because that definitely brings a spiritual dimension at the same time, this degenerates over time, right? And the proof is you, right? The proof is your level of, your lack of power, your lack of accomplishment, your lack of control. These ancestors of ours were constantly seeking for saving the system. It was the actual point, right? You could study it, even if you're not interested in history of religion, the actual one. You could study it from the Von Kriege. You could study it from simply understanding the connection existing between politics and war. Instrumentally, you could study it for seeing why, for example, you can be parasitically maintained in a wealthy system where essentially a few others made the most. So you just, being maintained in that fashion without any particular worth or merit whatsoever, etc. But the point here is that 2,000 years ago, the great part, of course, since the fall, great part of the damage had already been done. And in the various stages of degeneration of mankind by the Common Era, and that's also why the necessity of rebooting through refocusing on the spiritual dimension. This is true for Christianity, as far as for Buddhism. They all stem from the same idea. These are essentially military principles, right? They do not stem from any pacifistic or any sort of actually meek or tame or subject ideas. They may have developed in cultures that were, depending on which we're talking about, of course, in interest of time and even within it, more or less inclined toward a certain direction. There is no doubt, for example, that Catholicism, the way it develops in Western Europe, is much more powerfully aggressive and successful than one you see elsewhere. And this is also thanks, and this is the part of the video, to the Germans. But in order to understand it, you have to mostly watch my videos about, the Middle Ages, the Western Middle Ages, and especially also the later etc., because you can see the fruits of that. Yes, they made something along that line, even though it wasn't just about or necessarily about this. 2,000 years ago, great part of the damage had been done because the general success of this great civilization that had been Rome, there had been others, the Huns, there were the Guptas in India, that there had been major, say, acting in parallel, but still as universal forces on their own. Rome being by far the most successful, given the, in fact, essentially tribal and warrior background that, say, from which one city, like not even a people, in a extensive sense, eventually was mostly like the Romano-Italic one, nationally speaking, that managed to imperially rule over the others. But Rome really started from Rome, right? It's something that, overwhelmed the entire world, starting from just one point, not even a broader group, regionally speaking. And the Romans, in many ways, and we've seen it in multiple videos, had and we're not so lucky to have it so well documented as for the Germans, for which you should thank people like Tacitus and the entire, say, also later Christian sources that inexplicably some people say, oh my god, they were biased, where you should, if you're into Germanistics, what you should do every single day is to go to church and light up a candle for all these people, Adam of Bremen, Caesar, because if you do not understand that, it means, again, you're in the trashy bag that we described before, and you do not have a culture. You do not belong to the purest traditional European ethos. You're not a Westerner by definition. It doesn't matter anything, where you were born, what you look like, what language you speak. You cannot afford to be too big. Point. This is the problem, right, that we have with people in general today, that they think that they're owed something just because they partially exist in just for a while, and eventually they vanish out there. That's what the actual doctrine says. If you do not accomplish imperially, right? But again, do you see what's wrong with this mentality? Is that we have people who actually believe this in the, say, some of the people who go against, for example, the Imperial Catholic tradition. They don't admittedly know even what it means because they've never heard it, nor by family, nor by school, nor by church, by anyone. Is, I don't know, I will make, I was brought up a Christian, let's say, and I hate it because the actual problem is not Christianity, but that you come from a scumbag, disgusting family to begin with. So instead then becoming a dignified human being, I will emphasize my mental disturbance by fixating and alienating with fantasy that is feministic words, such as, for example, the ones of Tolkien. Yes, it's not that I despise the guy or the work, but fantasy is feminism. It is a very specific psychological, hormonal balance that makes you lean towards fantasy when you have history. So if you don't know what Catholicism is, but you know everything about Lord of the Rings, you may want to visit a psychiatrist to begin with. But the actual point is that we have the actual meek idea, the anti, what you're criticizing normally for what you think. It's not I'm very tender towards Christianity myself in general, right? But what people think, which is a completely different thing from what Christianity is that it's somewhat meek, right? It somehow, I don't know, stops at a point that says to just be gentle with people, and nobody really knows that. I mean, according to such view, what the point of it all really is, because of course they haven't gotten to the point at all, is that they deplore power, right? I don't know how to break it down to you, but the entire ancient world and the entire Indo-European beliefs, the entire, again, imperial ethos and traditional one was revolving exclusively, right? I hope that you even know what exclusively means, etymologically speaking, what these languages were defining with on the basis of the cosmological phonetics, for that matter, what that actually also means, by the way, on the Imperium, on the Holy Ghost, on the Nike, on the Victoria. And those who could not have that were over. So the entire, and truly meek, and not because it was actually Christian, but because it was simply, degenerated sort of misunderstanding of Tolkien's regarding providence to begin with, is inexplicably like the same thing that you're allegedly criticizing about a religion that you do not understand, and thinking exactly that your ancestor was some, in turn, prevaricated peoples that did not seek to obtain power themselves, and that had the greatest accomplishment in not being corrupted by it, but by actually acquiring more, and settle for what? For being an average idiot living in the middle of nowhere with no power, with no wealth, with no capacity of wielding that power, material and spiritual alike, because there is no difference in the traditional doctrine. We explained it in the video about the traditional meaning of space, as a matter of fact. Of course, if you live in a dualistic Gnostic heresy, you will think that, of course, like, for some reason you should, throw away everything and simply starve to death because you do not have the spiritual backbone that must be developed by wielding power in order not to die and disappear into nothingness. And what do you actually think that these peoples, before evangelization, were actually doing, if not trying to expand as much as possible their power, as they also succeeded in doing so ever more when Christianity actually came in, and macroscopically in the history of civilization? This is the little criticism towards all who think that, Catholic or even just Christian means just, this is, part of my culture. This is some sort of Semitic, regurgitation of, evil and subjugation and wanting to regulate other. Do you actually know what Catholic means? Again, I will not probably say it other 30 times, during the rest of the video, May 29. And the reason why I make this is that what the Germans accomplished in late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, far, and going back to the original point, from actually collapsing the system further, was actually saving it, right? The peoples who lived in the Barbaricum more or less kept living as they did. Right, they didn't have any major sort of relief, at least because even when the migration era was over, a lot of resources had been exhausted. So for a while they wouldn't fare particularly well themselves. They stagnated. The same is true for the civilized places in the first place. Except when you look, especially at Western Europe, you realize that, and as we've seen many times, a veritably solid and also long-lasting dominions resisted this shattering and went on to essentially found the major Western nations, the ones that at some point literally took over the world and had already been, by the way, the seat of the Imperium, always in their Christianization revolved around the spiritual guidance of Rome. That, again, I will not open the parentheses. I'm very much more of a Ghibelline than others, but Ghibellinism is another thing, and hatred towards the church, and essentially depicting this as some sort of counter monster wanted to destroy virility and imperial power, actually lays the fundamental element, right, of femininity that must be used by the virile force in order to tame, possess, and transfigure as the absolute precondition for divine transfiguration and salvation, which does not mean elimination. It means integration, right? And besides the fact that it's not like the church was out there claiming that the empire did not exist. or denying that that was a thing, or even during the struggle, the investiture controversy, never came, in fact, to deny such authority in the first place. And I would like to stress that this is especially true in the moments of the fiercest struggle for investiture, like in the 14th century the moment in which both universal authorities were declining, and eventually they reconciled themselves pretty soon, right? In like the empire and the papacy in modern age were all loving and having each other's back, but it's exactly at this point they weren't actually denying that such roles had to exist. Of course, you can make the point that, I don't know, the role that the church envisaged for the emperor was essentially a sort of vassalitic one, and so not allowing, in a sense, the sun to spread his wings and fly. But this is exactly the point. None of the two universal authorities could exist had the extreme prevailed, right? The empire on its side could take over the world, but it wouldn't, right? And in the Imperial Catholic tradition, if you don't, it's because God does not give you the power. So even if you believe that there was this terrible opponent that you actually need in order to transfigure, because it's also part of the wall, and it's actually succeeding where you're failing, the question is, why did you fail? There's no space for failure in the Imperial Catholic tradition. There is no space for scapegoating. This is instead what, again, I see 90% of people recovering these ideas are simplistically, childishly, and ignorantly doing, without any trace of traditional doctrine or indication why this balance would be the case, right? I don't know, trying to read Evolov, for example, without any guidance, or pretending that it was just, I don't know, that he had a solid historical background, or twisting everything he says just because you don't understand a book of such a great thinker. After all, the question is, why are you even speaking? Why do you even think, if you do not have personally that power, that your outlook on life is so successful, and where are you actually going with that? Because I do not see emperors in this world. I do not see divine transfigurations. I do not see like a reversal of the generation of mankind, right? When you go back to the contact between the Germanic peoples and the Roman Christian world, you realize instead that something very, very important happened, right? Again, you can look at, from one side, the initial Germanic incursions, initially disrupting the material structure of the empire. And so what had, say, not even correctly in this sense, because the Romans essentially caused most of the damage, the Germans, or the barbarians in general, destroyed only along the way what they could loot, and they knew they would where they wouldn't settle, right? Because it's dumb to begin with to destroy a place where you have to stay, which is instead what was religiously preserved when they were to settle. There are actually very good relations. Even from the Aryan side, look at Theodoric. The first thing he does, really, he's the greatest hero in the Germanic epos of the migration era. And the first thing he does after he kills Odoacer, after the siege of Ravenna, is to go to Rome to make reverence to the papacy, even as an Arian. Again, I made this clear also in the videos about Ostrogothic Italy that you can check out. You have Clovis, as we said, that installs, as we will see now, a new order, a truly new world order, on the basis of the Gallo-Roman elites, clienteles. There is no doubt that Romanity, its material base, helped dramatically the fostering of this greater spiritual miracle that occurred in the West during these centuries. and that great part of what was lost at everybody's detriment, right? Nobody won out of this, and this link is quite important to understand because, as we will see, you couldn't explain either how and why the feudal system, what we call so, was established, and why a very particular set of values of moral code was molded within this now Romano-Germanic reality. That was instead the author of a massive revitalization in the history of mankind. In proper Imperial Catholic power. It took some time, not too long. Actually, Charlemagne is less than 3 centuries after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire. I discussed this widely. There is a playlist properly called Renovatio Imperii, but you can find actually a lot of this, and especially about this Germanic dimension in the video about the Merovingians, Clovis, the Franks as the spring of European civilization in this period, for sure. And also, in fact, in that case, explaining what we will not do today, even though we have hinted partially at the essentials, why the Franks managed to rise over, for example, so the Goths, etc., and why those other perspectives failed. Why, for example, the pagan Arian axis failed. To an extent, here I call pagan more conventionally the, say, non-Christian reality, not that those, as we said before, those pagans were into paganism, right, as we were saying before in the elites, nor the Arians, even though, as I was hinting at before, there had been quite a shock, quite a sort of lack of confidence and belief that had spread all over the world by that point. And this, we'll see it better now, was particularly true for the Nordic Germanic stock. Right? This is a problem that very few people seem to have pretty clear in mind. If you look at, this is explained in other videos, also the one about the Norse Germanic religion through the Indo-European reading, we talked about this also for the Celts, that there wasn't, as some people tend to picture here, like, the guys who actually got what the Imperial Catholic tradition was, and the Romans who had lost it, and so the Germans simply replaced the Romans, and it was it. The Germans themselves had been, like, as old, essentially fringe peoples of the underdeveloped barbaricum, first of all, gravitating around Rome, very well aware of the fact that this power existed and that they were at the outskirts of this, and that, emanatistically speaking, they were not wielding even a fraction of power that the Roman Empire had, say, in the early imperial age. Also, later, if you look at it, you don't have anything stemming from the Germanic world that reaches the same level of absolute power that, or relative one for that matter as well, that the Romans had done. This belongs to another era in the broader metaphysics of mankind. The Germans managed to install themselves as fundamentally a staunch minority into, say, the much more populated and developed Roman world, and ruling as elites, also with the majority of the people, however, mixing with the rest of the population, in fact going under. We'll see it now, because the general people, as we've seen in the world, had gone down, right? The wars of expansion, of conquest, etc., had burned physically resources, and the spiritual forces had not been enough to keep things together. The great part of the world had depopulated itself, so and I anticipate this concept now, the Germans were the ones that, at least the Romano-Germanic elites, because that's where it started from, Also, you could argue Celt or Romano-Germanic elites, because especially the Merovingian centrality, regionally, ethnically, culturally stems from that world, with the Gallic element being very central in this, but all mixed, like indistinguishable at that point, also from the Roman one in a, in a physical sense, right? So the point being that these elites had to make up in terms of individual quality for the collapse of the rest of the people, right? And so what you see throughout all the entire Middle Ages, aside from the ups and downs of people's power, in the 13th century, people had reacquired a lot of power, for example, but so, and even more, the elites had done. We've seen this often in the videos about cavalry and infantry during those years. Like, it's not like, I don't know, it was all the increase of cavalry is directly proportional to the inferiority of infantry. No, right? They go in parallel. And as I was explaining yesterday about, for example, the French feudal hierarchy, French feudal order at the time of Louis IX, the great success of this civilization was giving everybody a place in the broader organism, in the broader hierarchy, and allowing for this to grow, but ordered within it, within this frame, which is an enormous accomplishment. This, to some extent, was not achieved successfully in the same way, even by the Romans, right? But it's debatable there what the sort of metaphysical balance really was, and also what the Roman world had been especially in its beginnings. I have something incoming, in fact, very similar to this video, next week. So what you see essentially throughout all this time, and even after, until basically the French Revolution or the end of the First World War, depending on which parts of Europe you're looking at, is really the continuity of this balance, right? And it beautifully exemplifies how, in fact, the people never sort of recovered to a great extent. At least we did materially, because, as we were saying in the beginning, we greatly benefited from someone that also from within the Third Estate. There is no doubt that there is an aristocracy that does end together with the ancien regime, because it has burned out itself, like so in this increasing degeneration. So yes, we succeed in so many other ways. Civilization did not die. It went on, but it became ever more sort of tonically regulated, ever more materialistic, ever more distant again from the source, the actual spring of spiritual power, and as such becoming ever more riskily close to the brinks of collapse and self-destruction, which is very likely and sort of, even not the problem, because people are very cowardly, and very often the aforementioned group tends also to be very meek towards the first barbarian that comes out and fakes to be more powerful than them, but they let themselves being brought under because they're weak morally, right? Even though they would have all the means to stem the thing. It's always a matter of will to power, right? But what the Germans really do at the time, their chiefs, especially their elites, is realizing that, in fact, this opportunity of reviving the system is possible. The problem with them, as I was saying religiously, is that these people had really been battered by the events, right? These weren't, triumphantly entering, conquerors that thought of themselves, like Alexander conquering Persia, or, making this feat that would be reminded. Of course, the great leaders, as we were saying before, were celebrated in the sagas. We talked about Dietrich von Bern, Theodoric von Verona. We talked about Alboin. There are great names, also more or less historical figures that at some point were, however, really indicating the models that had existed historically and mythologically in the Germanic world to follow, right? But of course, the result, as we were saying before, is relatively meager, right? The more successful people are the Franks, but there is not this huge even epopee about them that sort of prorompantly leaves further, other than, we don't even have the Song of Clovis just per se. We have maybe the Chanson de Roland, we have Charlemagne, we have later, of course, like a more modern secular world celebrating this great leaders, the great rulers. There is much in Charlemagne that is of that properly primitive, hard, strong temper and will to power kind of vibe. This is true for the Ottonians. We will talk about them today. This is true for the Hohenstaufen. We will talk about them later because I have another video in store regarding properly the meaning of the Ghibelline ideal and properly the imperial monarchy, and what for the Germans this had come to mean truly in by the 12th, the 13th century, where we have enough documentation to also admire. So, for example, the reedition, at least the writing down of the very migration era sagas, the Nibelungenlied, etc. What properly this world was still alive, but as we know, that world by the 14th century fundamentally stalled, and then there is another major civilizational crisis in the 14th, and so time degenerate once again. Sin piles up on our shoulders throughout the generations, and so everything becomes ever more complicated. So it's easy to see, right? In the ancient world, you have Rome does something unthinkable, and then in the Middle Ages you have this Germanic culture, but in comparison it's an ever more sort of attemptive work that still also falls, and still today, right? There are say powers ever more fastly rising and falling, and you don't really see much a traditional spirituality to begin with. You just see, again, the aforementioned group of people self-sabotaging themselves by fakely claiming that some people are traditional while they absolutely aren't. They are the ones that are pushing instead by far the greatest underdevelopment and atheism and anti-tradition. Even compared to what has happened in the same West, that after all does wield that power, and there's a very specific reason why that is the case, and what you can't simply measure unless you are, again, heavily as cognitively dissonant with reality. Now, this is not just it. It is, as I was saying before, that essentially by the Common Era, people in general, and this is true, not just both in the Roman world and, say, in the Barbaricum, but especially comparatively to Rome, in the Barbaricum, that the sense that fate could not be changed by the hero's work was really believed, right? We have this idea, okay, these were rough and tough. They actually thought that heroes could still make it to save the world. Actually not. It was the other way around. It was rather the Roman Empire, like probably the Dorian, the Italic civilization that had been blessed, of course, by the greatest power, and in the great Alexandrian and Roman parabolas had really come the closest to that literal molding of the world at the ruler's will. This has been Augustus' golden age. This has been the general imitation, in fact, of the Megas by all those who came later. That specific meaning is more radiant, properly Apollonian culture, right? That also is the one that, having achieved so much, however, sort of doesn't handle, reaches the peak and then sort of goes down. The peoples in the outskirts have an incredibly dark, often chthonic and negative kind of attitude towards the possibility of actually saving the world and transfigured divinely. And you can't, traditionally, the only thing you can do is blaming them. But say in a conventional sense, you can't, a colloquial one, you can't really blame them. Why? Because of course they have been beaten repeatedly. These people had not managed for a very long time to break through, to succeed, to obtain more, to wield more power. They had essentially been battling each other's tribes all along the way. They had, if anything, and this is very important, this is the good that is really revitalized in an incredible way within and by the Germans truly in an Imperial Catholic direction regarding the exact measure of, let's say, the acknowledgement of the exact measure of the failure, in as much as if you really live constantly in this situation, you know how difficult it is to actually win, to actually achieve. And you know also how much it takes, like, to self-sacrifice, because very often these people were always battling because they truly had no other choice but doing so in order to survive, because resources were definitely too scarce, and if you were a bit sort of weaker, more, say, gentler, you didn't have much of a deterrent power and capacity, for some reason you would have gone under, right? And this actually happened to a lot of them. It happened to them also against Rome. Think about the Cimbri and the Teutones. This is think about the Celtic world also at large, right? It cannot be said. Let's say initially the Celts were sort of very dangerous, very loaded, right? In the early, let's say in the 5th, in the 4th, in the 3rd century. After that wave, so they sort of give ground, and Rome, after all, takes them over in a almost embarrassingly easy way. There was no match, right? And even if there was, like in a broader civilization, in a campaign or a battle, there was no real civilizational chance along the way. It's not like the Romans hated these peoples or wanted to vilify them or to demonize them. They just were, in a sense, underworlders compared to Rome, and as such, they were sabotaging. They were trying to resist. They were, even when they had sort of lost, think about, I don't know, the Druidic infiltration into Roman conquered Gaul, and from Britain, and eventually what happened to Britain later, right? And say the fact that the entirety of Gaul was brought under in only 8 years, right? It was not really Caesar's fault if the Gauls did not have a literature, as also the most developed of the Celtic peoples at that time. So that actually speaks volumes about the actual ratio of strength involved. And again, there are lots of people who hate this kind of talk because, again, you see, the Germans had their time. We're talking about them. The Celts too, but since they were essentially wiped out by both the Romans and the Germans, we have this idea that, they lacked the chance to express their potential, and so those will sort of annihilatingly and also clinically disturbingly sort of identify with the past, the dead, right, at this point, want their sort of passive-aggressive, sort of delusional way of saying, no, but we won, we ambushed a Roman legion in Scotland, disappeared. Guys, there's no way around this. The Celtic military average is probably the single most overrated thing in the annals of warfare. And this is not to say that in their own way they weren't effective or they didn't score their victories over the Romans, over other people. Like, there's no doubt, but let's be macroscopically honest. The Germans themselves, the Germans prevail also over the Celts, and also, as you know, we distinguish not just the Celts from the Germans, but also, I don't know, these people from the Italics and others, as if we were talking about strict categories like 19th century nation-state style, right? These were essentially, say, groups of peoples had been hegemonized by Indo-European conquerors and more or less sharing the same values, almost the same language. The Gallic declension is the second Latin one, by the way. The Indo-European etymologies are excruciatingly the same. The Romans, in the way they describe the Germans, for example, and thank God we have that, really understand what that was about, right? Even if they had differentiated themselves, they had also gone ahead in that same vision of the Imperium in different ways in terms of merit. Like, you read Tacitus, and in spite of his bias, in spite of that it's not the bias that it's an invented story and that there is a parallel reality and forbidden history that we have forgotten because the evil Roman. No, right? We're talking in terms of just, I don't know, not being strictly precise about certain, or open for that matter, or explicit about certain explanation. But if you actually read even just the Latin that he uses, you do understand how vibrantly in tune with the actual meaning that we know from Germanistics, from anthropology, from obviously the same Roman sources. These are all fully coherent with the Imperial Catholic tradition shared by both. The point, though, is that the seriousness in understanding faith as some sort of law that has already been written and the hero that is not able to bend it. It's just essentially waiting for everything to collapse. This is essentially Protestantism as well. This repeated in the same identical way in the Renaissance. Works are worthless. This is the same idea, right? And this wasn't even quite the same, being that people actually thought that works were worthy, but they would have not been enough, which, if you look at God's infinity, it's as if to say that, yes, they were infinitely less, except in Protestant times, people had forgotten in part what properly the metaphysic value of every action really had. Say the implications also of spirit and matter. In the ancient world, like, this awareness of the immanent power in the universe and the fact you could sort of use it was still very much alive, and still very much alive in a tradition that was sometimes in an occult way salvaged over the centuries, also within the church and outside of it, as we well know, by the way. And it's not like it was much of a mystery. It's just that the church did not want to make like the average idiot believe that they could just do whatever they wanted, and that first they had to be sort of reordered spiritually in order to be able in the first place to pose themselves. And this is not just about the average idiot. It's actually the same investiture controversy. The idea, who are you to wield all the power in the world? Can you? If I can challenge you, you failed, means that you weren't the one, right? So it's actually an incredibly fair issue, and it's not like they were forbidding anyone to be emperor. They were actually invested in themselves. But let's leave aside this side of the story. I talked this problem of the lack of belief that the world could be saved, essentially, by the individual, in the videos about sacred royalty, about the Sol Invictus, etc., that by far from being, that's also what the average idiot thinks, oh, that thing brought by, Mithraism in days, because before it did not exist. The Sol Invictus was present all over these peoples always, all right? They all believe in the same identical thing, right? Except the degree by which they did so differed. And if you were to look at the Germans, these were actually the ones that had lost more than the Romans easily. You can easily understand it in terms of models of power, symbolic representation, the approach to divinity. And much of what you see of the shattering of the Roman Empire by the Germanic invasions stem in a way exactly by this. It was essentially a sort of sabotage, irrational, very Dionysian to an extent, that instead the chiefs, the elites, the first kings that are created in this sense by the Romans, instead handle differently. That did start from actual hatred towards the empire. There were many Germanic warriors who were posing themselves as the anti-Rome, as literally the anti-God. It's some concept you find even in National Socialism in later very different times, in that sense of the idea of if the world failed us in a way or in another, if we really come out of this huge disappointment and suffering and pain, which is actually a very relatable, human condition in many ways, the idea is that we do not actually want to go on with this anymore. We prefer to destroy everything in ourselves in the meanwhile, so that we can actually see what really happens in the end. And if, like, say, the way of the left hand actually tells you how in the Imperial Catholic tradition, killing is not murdering, but killing specifically is necessary in order to achieve divine transfiguration. So it's as if the Germans had, let's say, this sense of the idea of the lost cause, of the impossibility of salvation was looming over the world. It's not like every person believed the same, especially the elites. We will see them now, the heavenly ones in the Germanic world, knew that there was something awakening, that this was a dramatic situation, it wasn't actually good for anyone, but that there was something in terms of power acquisition that could salvage the system, could provide to the better people sort of a better place, and start remolding the world on that basis. It would be too long to digress on the Romano-Germanic relations. Again, there is an entire playlist, the migration era, one dedicated largely to such topics. But they are all part of that proto-renovatio imperii, or renovatio imperii to court for that matter. So this collapse of the empire, traditionally speaking, occurred because of the failure of the Romans. All right, I made a video that properly analyzes it's titled the sins of the Romans and the conquests of the barbarians, to highlight the Catholic struggle problem. It's not like the Romans were also completely collapsing. That's sort of the anti-Romanistic view. They had actually, in many ways, still a massive amount of power to deploy, except the modes now were mostly dominated by the Germanic conquerors that managed to subdue most of the Romance population, who allowed this to happen as well, for the sake of stability, if anything, and sort of Romanized and largely the Germans. They taught them essentially how to rule a political territorial reality with very specific sort of fixed regional dimensions, which the Germans had never done before. The Germans start legislating in Latin. They're also beyond the lands of the Romans get evangelized. This is valid also for the Celts in Ireland or in Scotland. There is a great sense, actually, of this Catholic issue that really tells you how people, yes, had sabotaged this world, but they wanted the legitimate imperial authority to remain there, right? The Romano-Germanic kingdoms largely formed institutionally on the presupposition that they were still partaking to the Roman Imperium, right? That these lands had been sort of given, of course, first of all by God, but also by the other media on earth, so the other powers that could stop you, or also the church that was disciplining your actions. In this sense, from the right medium that Rome had been. So whether it was Constantinople at this point, say, as the Roman Empire left legalistically, or the Church of the Holy City of Rome that remained, of course, the center of the major civilizational irradiation throughout all the West, throughout the entire early and high Middle Ages, and with a massive civilizational output still to this day, throughout the entire world. This offered, in fact, the possibility of simply keeping to nurture that imperial power that now the Germans had truly seized and wielded in part on their own, right? So truly being given that traditional liberty that God allows in order to exercise with power and wielding an ever greater one. The most shocking aspect of this all is what is happening within these Romano-Germanic communities, because the revitalization of the system, albeit starting mostly from a spiritual point of view and taking its time against the material, and so the sin, the accumulation of sins that had piled up over the centuries, makes it sort of slower. definitely creates, during the migration era, the necessary preconditions for, in fact, the establishment of a new, vigorous civilization that not only we know very well from videos like yesterday's and in general the ones I make about the great medieval civilization, mostly, starting at least from within Latin Germanic Europe, and from this also expanding further and molding it in an incredibly solid and definitive and continuative way, but that also was to reaffirm in the Renovatio Imperii the Roman symbol, right? The Holy Roman Empire is not just a name. It's not just what that hypocrite of Voltaire said. It is a very precise symbol, polity, and actual power that we, of course, came to appreciate in a very historically minutious way, given the interest they have in the various parts of the Holy Roman Empire, its history, etc., but that also, considering its genesis in the Carolingian Empire and beyond, does have a symbol that sort of also was spread continuously again, right? The Byzantine Empire left us at some point, and you can see all over the world eagles, fasces, all symbols of Romanity practically everywhere as the single most hegemonic symbol of power in the world still today. The Germans had a lot to do with this. Today's video is not exactly to dig, as I was saying before, into the roots of the Renovatio Imperii as we consider it more conventionally. At least this could also help to do so, but I would like to focus strictly on the Germanic character, right? On what it meant for these peoples to do what they did in the reshaping of the system, and how it happened, at least in a spiritual sense. Historically speaking, again, I made hundreds of videos, if not thousands, on this. But what did the Germanic element add specifically, right, characteristically to this? This is what this video looks at. In a way, it doesn't make sense even to categorize this, because in the universal tradition, it's just by which degree the Germans sort of adhered to the divine standards. But of course, every time, as we've seen in place in history, has a different meaning proper, and so you have to appreciate it both for the origins of the Germans, but then eventually where they settled and what they achieved. So it's incredibly relevant if framed within this view. What is also striking, and that's why I made all that tirade at the beginning, is the quasi-rectification of Christianity, or at least the interpretation of it that had, in a sense, adapted to some of the more sensualistic, pathetic and sort of subcultural degrees among the masses, right? The exhausted masses of the Mediterranean, that at some point collapsed also to other power. Think about Islam in the East. That's also quite relevant of peoples that had been overly spent, right? After all, Western Europe was still a sort of a young force. And as we said, it's a Romano-Germanic attainment more than just a Germanic one, indeed. If anything, just look at the demographics. But it's as if, in a truly metaphysical sense, the Germans rectified Catholicism itself, right? Particularly concerning the general outlook on life. Essentially, it's the relation between men that mold the world. And this is, I think, extremely important, because even though, of course, power is immanent practically in anything, men are the ones who have the greater contact with the divinity among all within all the universe, and as such, they are the ones from which tradition has to restart in order to go back to hopefully invert the fall. The reason why I call this a miracle lays in the fact that this awakening of the highest vocation among the Nordic Germanic stocks during the late antique, early medieval era stemmed from both the concept of Roman universality, so properly the Imperial Catholic, and the Christian principle. The latter in particular being the most difficult one to understand. Like the relevation of these stocks to a prior level of Catholic awareness through the paradox of using essentially not iron and blood to settle matters ideally, but the traditional wisdom that belonged to the ancient Germanic chieftains, naturally had acquired it through bloodshed and iron, and knowing in fact what wielding power really was, but the hand is to manifest through the sheer power of spirituality. In other words, if you are perfect, you can even achieve transfiguration. You can achieve like what essentially Christ does, and so proving, right, in this sort of humbling fashion, that even the last of the last has within the spark to reawaken world domination and to consciously will it, and that therefore this mere extermination and cult of blood, as it was the case in the Germanic world, we still know that by the time of Gregory the Great, there were some Christian Franks that practiced human sacrifice. It was absolutely normal in a sense. Again, it had been true also among the Romans since the early era, the spoliopium and being human sacrifice, same gladiatorial games actually had to do with that. The Germans did that as well. They did so talking about sort of the equivalent of a gladiatorial, aside from the massacres of entire peoples that they sometimes called deliberately the Romans to come and watch during their tribal feuds, etc. But I don't know, making some naked youth run among spears, like same betting on who would survive out of that. Like it was objectively about this very, as we've seen in part, contempt towards the idea of especially of a higher authority that was simply dictating them what to do, and so doing the unimaginable just to try to reawaken that primordial, say, metaphysical power to bend that word, as we'll see now, and also to literally habituate themselves to this kind of atrocity in order to be able to handle the greatest monstrosity that sin would present in a battle, in a massacre, in that incredibly tough tribal politics that the Germans navigated themselves in with, as you know, white bloodshed. And that's why they made excellent, again, warriors individually. They weren't so equally performing initially in the early Germanic period. Say, I don't know, pitched battles or whatever, but the Roman emperors used them as bodyguards, not just for the size, but literally for the ferocity. And it would have been really frustrating for these Romans to foster actually the Germanic youth in Rome and sending them back as client rulers, and just to see them stabbing each other to death at some banquet, as it was somehow typical and stereotypical of these peoples. Say the Romans were not particularly, say, more tender than that, but they had a much more regularized system that in part, however, had contributed in the stabilization of the institution to some sort of crystallization of the same. This reaches really the peak in the Byzantine world, And I would like to stress that because also the fall of the western half of the administrative part of the Roman Empire, and I would like to stress administrative in this sense, seems to have done really, having had a lot to do with the pre-existing sort of spirit of the Western European races. They were much more warlike, saying than as the Levantine peoples that, as we were saying before, were much more habituated to pharaohs, to kings of kings, to greater Alexandrian rulers, of foreign stock, etc. So this is, I think, really crucial. Like the way the Germanic element manages to combine with Romanity, with, say, Latinity or Italicness, or the Italicization, this is the right term, of the West, right? Gaul and Spain were not Italic countries, but they spoke Romance by that point. So that was also very demographically, culturally, and ethnically impacting deal that the Romans from Italy had achieved, and that had refused to do, for example, in the East. The East had remained essentially Greek, or Hellenistic at least, in that really different lifestyle where the Western Morris could not really graft themselves on. So when you look at the Germans in this migration era context, you realize that they serve to integrate their traditions at a higher level of this, if you want, on top of the same Romanity, and sort of in an organic sense with it, and to bring forth thus in a new form what had often materialized and particularized within the traditions of individual races. Because the world is never the same, right? And I made a video about the Heliand that, as you know, is the first Old Saxon texts that was passed down to us. It was composed in the 9th century, at the time of Louis the Pious, perhaps Louis the German. This is not so crucial, but this was essentially written by a same Saxon Christian who was essentially telling the Gospels in a way that the Saxons, that definitely were one of the single most radically and traumatically violent and brutal and bloodthirsty peoples in the entire Germanic reality, and that were that rough and tough to in fact have this enormous power and capacity, would be finally channeled in a successful accomplishment in the Renovatio Imperii of the Ottonian times. We're at the time of Henry the Fabler's father, right? Just to give you an idea of that. And so a world that obviously had known very much and very bloodily that contrast between the Carolingian, essentially Roman Empire, and this Germanic, if you want, sense of independence, but also confinement, right, in sort of a fringe dimension, without wielding actually many power. The Franks had always, ever since they had created their de facto Gallic kingdom, aside from parts of Germany, of course, up to the Rhine, were Frankish, but they had always been strong. The very central power was Neustria. There's no way around that. Had been more powerful than the Saxons. It's not like they didn't know, or they had a chance, right? In Charlemagne's time, the Saxons could simply say, okay, let's invade Neustria and create the Saxon Empire. No, that could have not really occurred in the first place. And I would like to stress the trauma from which this all springs, right? How without that, in fact, way of the left hand, without that meeting with death, without that blood spilling, you cannot quite achieve this level of divine transfiguration. The Heliand is beautiful, right? Because such duality, if you want, is vividly expressed in the work. You have from one side, as you know, Christ depicted with warrior characteristics, right? That one would say, well, they're not so evangelical, They're not evangelical in the sense, as we said before, that the Gospels are extremely spiritual in essence, right? Christ manages to wield divine power, to achieve divine power in the first place, because he has a complete wisdom, right? He knows how things will go, what he must do, and he doesn't flinch. He doesn't do anything wrong in absolute terms, and that's how his power comes by, right? That's how he can literally take over the world with his action without even unseating his sword. Naturally, it was extremely complicated for an old Saxon to understand what this meant, right? But why? Because, again, these were brutes or were stupid, or they sort of had, they just did not like meek things, because the Christians were, I don't know, I was using a bad word, but you understood more or less what I was talking about. It's not it. It's that they had to be convinced that, once again, the dark notion of fate, known in Germanic as the word, that had gained such prominence during the later Germanic period, could be actually overcome. Right? And Christ does it. In other words, we're showing them the actual deal. Yes, Christ was represented indeed in this sort of more intelligible way as a literal Germanic chieftain with his comitatus of 12, actually 13 followers, right? That would, when the guards arrive to arrest Jesus, St. Peter's unseats his sword, and he cuts the ear of the guard, and there is all this emphasis on blood. This hematophilia was particularly strong among the Germans. Again, it had already been very, very, very much of a thing under Clovis. There were entire hymns referring to Christ's passion, specifically written by Gallo-Roman clergymen, exactly to glorify Christ's self-sacrifice, but instilling the sense of bloodshed and it's a conquest in blood, right? Cross rising in blood, literally, right? To be more appealing to the 6th century Franks. This was the same with the Saxons. They had to understand in a way that was familiar to them, right? They had to make their own, in the sense that bloodshed could happen, but it was and had to happen in a sense necessarily. This is particularly evident in the Gospels as a self-sacrifice, and there are a lot of Bodanic parallelisms with this, but let's stick to the order of things. And yet, right, these people were to be understood that there is a greater force than merely bloodshed as such, that is just a sinful way of operating, meaning that as fallen, we cannot transfigure divinely but through sinning, in a way, or at least through doing greater good through sinning, right? So winning over this apparently impossible task. But that is exactly what has to spur us at least towards the sublimation of spiritual rectitude. And so all the sort of practices that the Germans had been carrying out over time, like I made multiple videos about the Germanic war bands, the comitatus, how these peoples were properly to annihilate themselves in front of the divinity in order to enter this brotherhood, in order to elevate themselves and gaining power, because that was sort of the most extreme way out of the Zippe that had sort of grown too lazy to do anything on that kind. They used to do it, like Tacitus is quite actually eloquent about the Lugi, for example, having this as a practice for the entire people, not just war banders, right? That tells you where sort of the older awareness were coming from universally. In that now, evidently, was a path pursued by too few. And Christianity was presented also thanks to the Carolingian elite warfare, like the let's say the opportunities that existed in an entire lifetime of this greater level of power cultivation that eventually had been the same one that had crushed the Saxons. This was a broken, conquered, destroyed people that now had to make sense of why they had fallen so low and so painfully. And what, however, was provided to them at this point, it was not annihilation, it was not this overarching word crushing them. Some of them would have thought that living under the new regime was such, because they, especially those who truly believed in that sense of I must win and accomplish, but for the same one exactly, like the loss was really the measure by which you had failed, and so you had not been enough. The Saxons are a beautiful example, because just like the Germans before, like if these had been a counter-Roman thing, they would have simply destroyed everything Roman, right? And there would have not been essentially what we know historically. These people decided to preserve it immediately, or knew even before entering the Roman world to establish an actual government, that's what they wanted. The same goes for the Saxons. It's not like, the Carolingians collapsed in the 9th century, right? The Saxons had been just conquered. They could have simply reverted back to paganism and done their own thing in a pagan name. They don't. They keep cultivating their own Catholic capacity, and they do it in a Romano-Christian fashion. The same goes for the Scandinavians. It's not like somebody invaded Scandinavia and imposed them to convert to Christianity. They converted to Christianity, and they reached the greatest level of power that had ever reached historically. And this could go on and on and on, right? Now, you see, this video is particularly long and complex because I've made so many others that explain in detail why, again, Christianity was doing what it was doing in a specifically spiritual sense, or what happened in these countries during the evangelization and whatever. So I do not want to digress every time I touch on one of these topics. I presume that you know where to find my content if you're not convinced or never heard of this before, and to just look at it. The word is an incredibly important concept. It's basically, as you know from the etymology, it comes from the concept of becoming, right? It's actually a very dynamic concept in the traditional essence. It's a bit what we have seen in the Hellenic world with the thuke versus the nomos, right? The thuke came to be the sort of fate, right, that you cannot really change. You're going against will only make things worse because you're so incapable you don't even know what's going on at the end of the day. And then you have the nomos, that is the meager human lame, so human meaning dirty, etymological adaptation to current law and government, etc. The thuke actually in the Hellenic, in the archaic Hellenic meaning was the will of the hero that molds the world accordingly, right? So it was not limited at all in the sense of determination. In a sense, it had still to be, right? Determinism and free will in the sense are coexisting in tradition, because everything that happens meant to be in absolute terms. And yet, this was also wanted, right? And so the Germans had basically abandoned themselves roughly, so this before Christianity, still within pagan world. This happened to the Romans after Augustus, basically. We're in the same exact period, which is also exactly the one in which Christ was born. There's a very specific reason for that. And that had really made them lose any hope regarding the fact of having a power that would be essentially just more than earthly, right? That would be essentially like maybe, yes, they believed that there was an afterlife. They believed that this offshoot, right, of your accomplishments would have some historical consequences, but they didn't think that this would have been enough to save the world. The world was, say, unavoidably rotten at the foundations, at the roots of its tree proper, by the cosmic snake, the Ouroboros, and there was this senseless principle that just basically destroys rather than creating and nurturing. And that there's really nothing that you can do. Just you can sort of buy some time, but at the end of the day, you're going to lose as well. And if you read, of course, the Germanic sagas, you know that pretty much like the entire story revolves around this: that the hero is so cool and brave and great, but he screws up at some point, and maybe he doesn't immediately. He actually does immediately suffer some setback in general, but at the end of the day he dies, has high his capacities where he as ruinously he falls, right, in a treacherous, dishonorable way that shows how lacking he actually was, rather than sort of attributing this sort of backstabbing to anyone in particular that should have been just created by you, right? So you don't have any excuse for them to have been killed you. You should have known better. You should have definitely halted this. And what is striking in the Heliand is that Christ, in this sense, is portrayed as being, as a hero, the very source of the word. So the Saxon clergyman who created this beautiful work nailed it completely, right? He told him, this guy is at the root of it all, right? There is a trade unit for which it's not like everything is being settled, right? We still must fight. We still must find ourselves in the valor for the end time. We must always struggle. Nothing really changes in that sense. But now there is a force who told us that we can do it, and we can do it if we can participate in it, right? And we will have to struggle because there is a battle in the end time, just like in the Ragnarok, and something is going to be lost, and we have to accept that evil does not go unpunished, right? But we will win in Christ if we really manage to make good use of what He allowed us to have. And not as humans, we do not know what will happen, but Christ does, because it couldn't be otherwise, right? And the promise here that the Heliand's author actually provides is this beautiful expression, that is to say that whoever dominates the world, he will acquire this magnificent power of God, right? So it was, first it was referring to Christ in general, but it could refer to anyone who said, well, you know what, I can arrive to divine standards just like Christ. Tendentially, I can close to it. I can wield so much power that I can fix so much the world that also Christ will reward me for. And this was the ultimate end that was hoped still, again, unknown forces against the obvious collapse, the fact that humanity was keeping to indebt itself, and this was evident to anyone, as it should be today, in a fashion it would make you see, but how can we get out of this? And through faith, we will see now the importance of the fetus in the Germanic war bands, so how appealable this was really for these guys we're discussing, would be the only possible answer. And we're talking about, of course, an imperial military one. For all the people who think that the Christianization of the German sort of distorted their near-end forces or did anything particularly wrong to them, look at what the Carolingian Empire became. Look at what the Holy Roman Empire became. Look at what the descendants of these powers became. look at the entire Latin Germanic West in the Middle Ages, between the 8th and the 13th century. We're talking about half a millennium of continuously striking growth. I think in relative terms in the history of mankind there's never been such a growth anywhere else. And here it goes really beyond that. It's not just about the entire Latin Germanic West, but also, especially also, think about Scandinavia compared to prior times. But think about Germany, and thinking about the revival of the Roman imperial idea being properly handled, at least, and led at least in a lay sense, even though it doesn't make much of a difference, meaning that there was the Church of Rome that was doing this in tandem with the empire, really equated to, right? And this doesn't have quite much boundaries. Again, it's mostly post-Carolingian Europe. Not only, right? If you look at, I don't know, the Anglo-Saxons themselves, if you look at, even all those countries that were conquered by this broader North Germanic world, think about Norman Sicily and its immense power in the High Middle Ages. Look at the Crusades. Look at the development, again, of throughout all these countries. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the communes, the Reconquista, the flower of chivalry, right? The Holy Roman Germanic later to be in, but properly that was just an addition. Here, remember the metaphysical centrality of the Roman ethnicity in the cosmos and the history of mankind. Right here, there could have all these peoples recognized the fact that Rome had topped that, right? And so they were continuing in her wake, right? The coronation of the King of the Franks already incorporated the very formula Renovatio Romani Imperi. And so a very precise language. This is not a concession to Romanity. These peoples were already fundamentally, especially the Franks, within Romanity itself. The Papal Frankish bond did not begin under Charlemagne. It was not even under the previous Carolingians. We're talking about something established since Clovis, really. And again, I promised I will not digress on these more strictly historical data that I already abundantly covered throughout all my channel. But the metaphysical ethnicity of the empire truly transfiguring the same Germans, right? Making them by far, especially the Germans narrowly meant, the Eastern Franks, in the second half of the 12th century, the greatest power in Western Europe, right? At the parity essentially with the Byzantines. Moreover, by adopting Rome as the symbolic origin of their imperium and their thus right to rule, the Germanic princes found themselves compelled to use their force to regulate the church. That is a topic that deserves really other videos, but that at this point had not been really settled in the broader sort of Guelph-Ghibelline orientation conventionally, but was felt in a much more intimate way, like the idea of the imperial standard informing the same purity of the church. This is how the Ottonians basically managed to rule over the church for a while. That's also how the early Carolingians, at least the early Carolingian emperors, thought really of the church like. The church always retaining its own, again, autonomy, and even in the strictest of control, being separated from the empire. Actually, the empire forced the hand in a completely human way. And this is also what the church did at some point from the other side. So there are these shifts in dominance, but the sense was that a strong church would have equated to a strong empire, and vice versa. And this is actually also during the investiture controversy what really does emerge. So the Germans pose themselves as protectors of the church in order to strengthen the same moral purity, moral standards, by their own imperial example, and vice versa from the side of the church. Again, I'm making things very simple because the video is very long, but you know what I mean. And so all this, and it's really impossible not to see it, not just because of the term renovatio imperii, but as an empty sort of trope, but truly, like this significant new movement emerges focused on a traditional restoration. There is an idea that there is an inherent power in Romanity that has showed the way also through Christ, and that this can be simply recovered difficultly but simply, and re-augmented, right, through the same literal Augustan force, augere, that's the etymology of the term, and so this augmentation of force in a divine sense of everybody involved in the world entirely, bringing essentially to salvation, to heavenly standards. If this could happen only through this harmony. That's why I would like to stress how ridiculous also the idea of power as corruption and nothing else really is, right? If people get corrupted, it's because they are weak, not because power is bad per se, at all, right? So God that wields all this power, where does it come from? In every context here, Christian, pre-Christian, whatever your thought, why that's the case. And if you also make the argument that, say, eventually God was come to be seen mostly as a sort of external force, hypostatically separated from the rest, and this was true already, again, as we've seen by the Common Era, for everybody involved, before that, like, what is that people were actually doing? Like, what was the actual alternative or opposite of this, or complement of this? Obviously, it was about the same standards of mankind. Politically, it was, in a sense, precisely the intrinsic ethos of the Germanic stocks that infused the imperial reality within this living, solid, and distinctive character. As we've seen, the Nordic Germanic world had been, up to this point, before redemption, before having showed the way, and the fact that these same Romans were confident, the Germans doing this and cooperating for the Catholic purpose, had been living in a quite dark world, in a quite violent one that had, as we have seen from the sagas, always warned about the inherent dangers of the world, the fallibility of mankind, the original sin, and even in the gold of the Asgards had been polluted by the netherworlders. For this reason, the ancient Nordic Germanic societies had lived, founded on the three principles of personality, liberty, and loyalty. Personality because of the responsibility falling on metaphysically on the individual, that is responsible at the same time for everyone and for himself. It was, again, this was shared. These were principles that were shared by the Romans back in the day as well, and that had generally, as we will see now, degraded for what the Germans also had to cope with in the aftermath of such collapse. Liberty, which, as we will explain better now, is, of course, stressing the fact that nobody has this capacity of power but you in all this, right? It's not just about responsibility, it's about the fact that you are truly on your own in every single moment, and that you have to demonstrate how every bond can be altered if your divine spark within can really do so, but obviously also for a positive end, not just for the sake of it, which is sort of what most people today passively aggressively, again in an incredibly weak condition, always ramble and complain about. And loyalty, which is definitely that bond, that link between people that can allow that compaction, that sense of community without, however, promiscuousness, right? The idea that the bond is this force that manifests in the imperium that does not alter, does not diminish, essentially dilutes or eliminate the necessity, responsibility of strength, etc. Right? This is incredibly important. I would say that Germanic culture owns this to an important degree still to this very day. There are sort of pros and cons depending on, in fact, this background, because don't think that really things really changed much. Right? The more I studied history, the more I realized that the inherent characters of peoples are at least millennia old. Like you can't really read them in so many different ways. They can change, they can develop, but the mold is always there. There is definitely a sense of evaluating the individual liberty outside the framework of a given abstract institution. Right? This was really alien to the Germans for a couple of reasons. First of all, because they truly had never seen a state, or at least lived within one. Many Germans had sort of become Roman citizens by this point, lived, this was the case, again, of every Indo-European. Like when they migrated, when they conquered, when they invaded, they did not live in a state, as we intended in a sort of modern secular sense. The Romans had achieved an enormous deal, but of course, like, people are fallen, and so in order to bind them together, you need an institution that, however, cannot be used simply as, again, an hypothesis for the lack of individual's worth. Without individual's worth, without this link in society, no institution can survive. This is also how the Roman Empire fell. So the Germans, to begin with, did not have that problem. And again, this was not positive because, again, look at what happened to the Saxons for not having a state, or at least not having that sort of more organic organization that did require some central control, some infrastructure, some sort of general administrative glue, right? Like even the Carolingians had. But overall, it's fair to say that if you look at medieval history and also the very aristocratic spirit of the Ancien regime, and we will scope this in a bit more precise way now, you do not really see the idea of a law that is above you in an absolute sense, right? This can always be broken and molded. This is, again, radically important because of all, especially the controversies regarding, say, for example, like the reasons, for example, for anti-Semitism. Regarding to this, I will not discuss this today, but I just say that Charlemagne thought to be David reborn, right? He was obsessed with the Old Testament. He was excited by the bloodshed, by God, Lord of battles, etc. So just to remember that in the same Jewish history, there is a rise and a fall, right, through all these, for all human civilizations, and that emphasize different things at different times, and still, however, contain a great deal of wisdom that you can simply dismiss. There are people who are simply phobic of anything of that kind, and they unironically tend always to be the ones that understand less the same North Germanic religion, while manifesting those traits of anti-Semitism, etc., because they fundamentally don't know. They're just statalists, right? They're nationalist socialists. They don't understand tradition, but just by definition, just any nationalist and any socialist, just the ism screws you. That's the problem. That, again, it's that dumb, right? It's literally like a child can understand this, but apparently the wide majority of adults is that dumb not to do so, and that's really shocking in my opinion. in any case, as I was saying, like there is sort of a great, say, a more genuinely, a more genuine power manifestation, we can say, in which an individual can measure himself with the absolute. In theory, with freedom. You see, I didn't use the term liberty before because freedom belongs only to God. But the idea is that, in fact, liberty is something cultivated in relation with the superior. All right. So the measure here in the societies is rather nobility. That, of course, as I was premising at the beginning, in a collapsed society where most people have thrown in the towel, well, definitely must affirm itself in a sort of feudal sense. We see it even from a military point of view. Cavalry at this point is superior to infantry. It's not entirely decisive. It will not be actually, but for a century and a half during the Middle Ages, but it's still superior, right? It will remain it. So, and it does correspond to this nobility, a nobility that is, say, represented in freedom, at least the juridically conventional idea of freedom that we have, meaning that, as you know, there were some classes essentially by Vergil that assessed what worthy of a man you were, right? And actually, you can't be a man if you are someone who cannot, for example, defend himself or whatever. Like, and that's literally like everyone has their own place in this, right? You can be so by being a slave that has lost its liberty, which is different from being, for example, a woman that technically does not have. She has a juridical autonomy, but she does not have a liberty. There is an incredibly weird group of National Socialists that buy into feminism and think that in Norse societies women were free. I don't want to express myself in certain terms because I would be banned from YouTube, but if you really want to understand what the complete lack of any trace of literacy in any form of Germanic culture really means, like make such a statement, this is literally the ABC of any history of law and just basic knowledge of Germanic laws, except they use the card, but those were written just after they were influenced by Christians. That's not how they lived outside. Really, because we don't have any trace of what you're talking about, and a woman finding out there is not the product of a conventionalized freedom of women. It's just, again, this exact measure of nobility that is, in fact, incredibly infrequent in the whole picture, both at the documentary and archaeological level, and it's completely normal to be so, including in its existence, by the way, so without any conspiracy theory. But we understand that the mentally feeble always sides with kind of weak ideas, unlike these people, as a matter of fact. This is why I don't use the term freedom, but liberty, because there was no such thing like anarchism or individualism, right? I just praised the individual. As I said before, there are people who do not understand the difference between individual and individualistic. They are two actually different words in your vocabulary. If you don't know the difference, you may want to go back to primary school in a first world country, even though you may have been raised in a first world country and going to school there, but still, of course, not having learned. I'm talking by standards, not by specific institutions for that matter. Remember exactly the traditional distinction. There's no hypostatic institution separated from existence. What this liberty really means is the embodiment of a dedication that transcended the self. It's a doctrine of the two natures that we have made a video on recently. It's also a very Christian thing, telling the truth. Again, different cultural background, different sources of this, but the point being the same. Like, you have to abide by higher standards, and nobody can infringe on them. For the Germans, it was just so natural because they lived in a world in which they were constantly with a weapon in hand, somebody trying to steal them that liberty, right? And so they knew somehow in that hellish actually hellish living condition what the reality really was. So some people, like when we look at the Romano-Germanic, the Germanic settlement during the migration era into Roman lands, also later we've seen the Carolingian conquest of Saxony was definitely the most dramatic of the subjugations carried out by the Franks. Of course, many people traded their part of their liberty, at least, for security, right? And this was not really. This had already happened among the Romans, right? This would, in part, contain in itself a problem within the same medieval world and beyond, like we do today. We have a very high standard of living, but we are somehow weaker. But in the Middle Ages, this system managed, as we were describing before, to elevate itself without actually eliminating this kind of communities. It should actually be pointed out that exactly the Germanic areas of Europe that were sort of civilized in this sense did witness the harshest loss in liberty of all, because they did not have a much of a, as we've seen before, a solid, strong, let's say, popular background. Yes, people were sort of more egalitarianly free, but simply because there were no resources. So it was more difficult to regulate the system. And we've seen how, Germany was ravaged by the Magyars, how essentially the entire medieval German political culture degenerates at some point to a complete lack of public authority. It's a privatistic mess that takes a long time before properly the national monarchy in Germany fails during the Middle Ages, in spite of its, and actually just after the peak of its imperial power, which should be noticed, so that you can't have that imperial power without having much of a state as well. France and England are something different. In fact, also they succeed monarchically in that national market, but also they're more advanced in that sort of secular modern vibe to some extent. This is all debatable because we're talking the Middle Ages again, but making a parallelism still with today. Remember that this is the same world we live in, the same countries we live in. But this does not mean, however, that, people living in 1500 Germany were living worse than, 500 Germany, Greater liberty does not necessarily equate to greater well-being, right? They're two different levels. They can intertwine, but they're not directly or inversely proportional to one another. It's what, in fact, this German sap manages to combine chemically in the Romance world that really is striking. And also, of course, from the Germanic areas of Europe, there is like a vigorous growth, also for the local standards that had yet to sort of elevate themselves civilizationally compared to post-Roman Europe. There was, in order, as we just said, to make up for that public culture in that state of regulation, the recognition of the transformative value inherent in loyalty to someone worthy of recognition to whom one voluntarily submits. This had been the case in mostly emergential circumstances, mostly war, that was so habitual, after all, in the Germanic world. But the idea of leadership cements further, right? Groups of believers formed around the leaders. It was a veritable religion. They truly believed, and as it was by Catholic tradition, that, of course, the chieftain, the warband leader, was the medium of divinity, that there was something divine about him, just by the manifestation of such following, such power that he could will, right? And there is this ancient adage that sounds like the supreme nobility of a Roman emperor is not to be a master of slaves, but a lord of freemen, who loves freedom even in those who serve him. Like if an Augustus had had a Roman citizen kneeling in front of him, he would have immediately have him rising, saying, what are you doing? Right? Something different from, I don't know, Domitian, under whom we see the first proskunesis, for example, in the Alexandrine model. This depends on the people, naturally. The Italics would have not, in fact, accepted to kneel in front of Augustus. It would have been something absurd for their culture. The Egyptians could represent Augustus as pharaoh, and of course, when he went to Egypt, he didn't have any problem about the Egyptians behaving like this, because the Romans legitimately thought that they were superior to such populations, that they had also conquered and actually stripping them from what was an Hellenistic dynasty for that matter. Made some videos about the Ptolemaic army. I talked also about this ethnic issue for that matter, but it's incredibly important to show the parallelism between Roman and Germans, because these were peoples that in different times had the same values practically, and this was true in general for like all the traditional societies. The only problem, unfortunately for us to an extent, or fortunately on the other side, is that for Roman times we don't have the abundance of documentation that we have for the German times, because the Romans could write about the Germans. Why? For the Romans, like, there were very few people who could write already. The same Italy was one of the first places to be, where literacy spread in the first place. So we're actually very, very thankful to all the peoples that throughout antiquity and the early Middle Ages documented the Germans, for us to have literally the best documented people in interest of this this transitional stage from a tribal society to essentially a feudal one to some extent, and having some degree of stabilization as well, but in a way that unfortunately we do not have, say, for the Greeks, for the Romans, and so on, or we have but much less. So there had been, so the state really would turn out as the sum of people, right? That to an extent, again, are not anarchoid. Only a society in which everybody is God can live without a state in the more conventional sense. The ethos of the ancient Roman aristocracy among the Germans was valid. It was basically a council of leaders, each of whom was free, let's say, a lord in his own domain, and thus having slaves working for him, having infrastructure, having land, having wealth to redistribute, and so on. Right? So there was a state, there was somebody paying for the military, there was somebody equipping you, actually, there was something already standing at the peak of actually Roman expansion already. Roman legionaries didn't start to be paid by Marius' times. They started to be paid by the time of the siege of Veii. But of course, it's this mix between tradition and sort of more, the best of the means available. So the capacity of handling them by spiritual moral standards that really makes a state, and that we can civilizationally evaluate in its success or not. And so think about the thing, think about the Leidang, think about the assembly of free people in arms that elect their leader. This was true in the Roman world as much as in Germanic one. The Romans had gone on something much more bureaucratic, statalized, infrastructural. The Germans were still at that stage where they had this capacity to make things standing, even though at a smaller scale, and when settling in the Roman world, actually creating a balance between the two things, right? Not throwing out either of the two, but actually developing them in a synergy that works successfully. And so you have the true statal standard, in a sense, also imperially wise, was represented among the Germans by the king at this point, which was also not really much of a normality in the Germanic world. There were many reges, the term is wîskuningas in reges, actually in Latin, for Germanic side, that, however, wouldn't have much success politically, in a, as we've seen, in political territorial sense, if not outside military expeditions. Right, the idea of sacrality of the king was the reason around which this leadership revolved. There were, in fact, not just military leaders or mere military leaders, but there were thought in the framework of the broader degeneration of mankind to actually having belonged to one of the lineages that had descended from more famed heroes, and so that had degenerated less from the divine origin. Just like, again, they had great houses of Rome descending from Mars, from Venus, etc. And in mythology, like history lost itself, right? So this was true for all these peoples. For example, among the gods, famously enough, you have the name Amals, which means celestial or pure. The Amali were the clan of Theodoric the Great, and so this heavenly and pure character was truly associated with the blood these kings brought with them. That's why they were so obsessed by blood, also because they thought that every time they killed someone of value in combat, in trial, and in war, their blood would be augmented, that this deed would actually increase their genetic strength and worth and power, like probably deriving from such this victory that had been naturally given by God. Among the Germans, there is also the issue of the actual political, tribal, clanic, national identity, depending on the levels. I will not digress much on this. I will just say that aside from all the ethnographic approximations, aside from these different levels, you have the single phara, you have the clan, the tribe, the nation. The actual unity and substantiation of such groups manifested in the context of action, ideally. It wasn't much about, yes, it was about this blood, but as you know, the Germans were not particularly fond of these kings. They thought, as we were saying before, that liberty, at least among those who had already established themselves in such condition, had to be preserved at all costs. There could be slaves, this could also be freed, just like it happened in Rome, and this was actually very frequent among the Germans because they needed manpower, right, for their continuous tribal warfare. And there are beautiful examples of this. I dealt with it, and the videos, for example, about Longobards, their origin, their foundational myth, and so on. And so the idea was that action transfigured and elevated. And so warfare was also the only place where a people could manifest its unity, which is actually the same thing that von Clausewitz says, that if you want really to test the civilizational value of a people, you have to see what he does in war, right? And so specifically in the achievement of a common goal during conquest or defense, it would be really a lot as such, because you can see so many different degrees of this. There are peoples who are, for example, in terms of individual value, sort of, say, the people who compose them pretty weak, but maybe they're huge and they make mass, and there's a much more acutely qualitative people that, however, gets overwhelmed because it has not managed to extend its moral power to convince the others to simply side with him. as such. And so history is really the testing ground for this. And notoriously, such leaders were chosen among the best ones, but once war was over, even though just temporarily, these leaders were to come back to their natural abode. Think about the same King Kimnatus in Rome. It was the same thing. Think about what happened to Arminius, leader of the Cherusci, that rises to power, to prominence after a battle at Teutoburg Forest, but eventually is assassinated because he was not sort of backing down. He wanted to control all of Germany practically. And the mere fact that he would be overthrown was the measure that he could not rule. Right? He hadn't been enough to rule. Not that theoretically he couldn't, but that the others would oppose him because they thought they were better. And so if you wanted to preserve this broader quality, you had to put this guy down. And these leaders were known in Latin in different ways. For example, duces, so properly the leaders, those who lead the army, the tigones as well. It's basically this is the latter is derived actually probably from the Germanic term here. There is the erstogi in Old Norse that properly means the leader of the army, right? And so you have all this other terminology. We explained one of rex, sacred royalty in the light of tradition, in the other videos. And you can argue that, of course, during the migration era, where these Germans settled down, but also before for the same needs of migration and the ones of the one of unprecedented scale that they had to undergo, like until the 2nd century AD, aside from the Cimbri, the Teutons, it's not like the Germans had been roaming around that much. Now, a condition of perennial movement, or at least also of surrounding more dangerous peoples like the Huns, or the same direct contact with being on the offensive with the Romans, brought to a greater need of compaction. As we said, it's actually the Romans that start properly the true Germanic royal institution in Illyria, and with Alaric, that remains ever since like the model of all the great Germanic kings. The guy basically was settled with his gods that substituted the Roman army of Illyricum. Actually, they were the Roman army of Illyricum. They used the local armories, and they were born like that, and eventually settled down, as you know, in Aquitaine, and from there, like Gaul, Spain. I have some other videos, of course, in coming on about the so-called Visigoths. But in general, the spontaneous establishment of some sort of more rigid form of hierarchy was coming from these centuries. As we were saying before, during the migration era, the Germans weren't favoring that. Well, they were desperate, right? As the Romans, as the Huns, everybody was in pretty dire straits. And so this increases from one side the level of militarization of the people. They're not like all big comitatus, but ideally, to some extent, they are peoples in arms indeed. And when they settle down, especially when they distribute wealth, landed property, other power, the hierarchy sort of increases as the social stratification. And so something changed. You have the Frankish commendatio, you have the vassalic beneficiary system. The, say, free lord becomes the vassal of the leader, whose authority extended to the power of life and death over his subordinates should they fail to fulfill their obligations. This, in a sense, was already present. It was some sort of proto-feudalism also in Tacitus' Germans. And the same principle behind this comitatus sort of would develop later also in the broader royal institution. There is the beautiful passage from the De Origine et Situs Germanorum 14, Principes pro victoria pugnant, comites pro principe. That is to say, the leader fights for victory, while his followers fight for their leader. It's plural, of course. The idea is that princeps, here plural princeps are this leaders in general, and comes, plural comites, are this war battle, those who bind themselves into this obedience, in this broader sense of loyalty and reciprocity. This was true also among the Celts, it was true among the Italics, it was true really in the entire tribal world, right? It was a principle of military equality, if anything, right? Tacitus explains how like the comites would ascribe their heroic deeds in honor of the leader, right? They were fighting properly for him, as we've seen, because he was the mean to this new life that they had basically pursuing in a greater transfiguring sense, having essentially devoted themselves to him, right? Doing something less than their leader in combat was considered a shame. And as you know, this in the real side of the story would get down to a lot of competition between everyone involved, and so this enormous political instability, constant warfare, because if anything, this was a regulatory ideal for which everybody had to stick to those standards. But the groups were small, and so even though the Germans were many, because they hadn't quite sort of developed again into some more cohesive force, and the sense was that, yes, especially the bodyguards, the earth-bearer, we talk about this in the video about the Anglo-Saxons, for example, but there is a lot also in the Gaelic Fiannas, was really contemplating this highest ideal of dying for the leader, of laying their lives down, because that utmost sacrifice would have been heavenly rewarded, and allowed also the others to go on in your own life to live within such enterprise, and hopefully your same figure, your same person, your same soul really achieving in the firmament like a higher place, and in the expectation of the end time and the final battle that had to be fought also through your own accomplishment. There is this sense of worth in such cohesion, for which, and this was really common in ancient cultures, wealth, for example, loot, whatever was gained from the spoils of war, had to be constantly redistributed, so that the individual warriors could be well equipped, more effective, more cohesive. And this is really true. Archaeologically speaking, we know that, for example, those Germanic peoples who had a more evenly, a more even wealth distribution were more politically cohesive and destroyed others. Maybe were even richer. They had richer elites, for example, but they were crushed because the backbone of the freemen were poorer. This is the case, for example, between the Longobards and the Gepids. We know it archaeologically. For this reason, and this was something that the Romans actually cared much about themselves, the Roman clienteling system was all based on this constant reinvestment. The Scandinavian counts in the Viking era referred to their leader as the enemy of gold in Old Norse, because this meant to be a generous person, essentially. As a leader, you were expected. They were not expected to keep any wealth for yourself. You had to constantly redistribute it, which was also basically this true embryo of state, right? How much you could succeed also as a single warrior, to have these people fighting for you, and the more you won, the more you could reward these people, and having them, being loyal to you and having a prosperous future and successful career politically, to also augment their power, seizing new land, giving them more to foster similar clienteles and expanding this truly imperial power, right? The leader was also called the host of heroes, due to the pride that he took in welcoming his faithful warriors. So companions as equals, companion really meaning those who share the same bread. Apparently also the Byzantine bucellari were something similar, as private forces that, the Lord paid some sort of, apparently at least this debated etymology, their bread, right? And those who share the same tent, for example, like if you look at the contubernum and in the Roman army, similar things. This was naturally mostly about a war band. It was a unit, all right? So like parallel found in other militaries as well. These people were taken in the Lord's home, hence the huskarls, treating them almost as relatives. As a matter of fact, many of them had blood ties, but also artificial ones, meaning that they were true and actually truer than others, as they would share their own blood and truly sharing everything till the end. This sense of camaraderie, of esprit de corps, was cultically practiced, as you know, by so many different communities, also different size for that matter. And the same blood ties, again, in a genetic sense, were deeply regarded as part of this kind of bond. Even among the Franks, before Charlemagne, joining an enterprise was considered to be a voluntary aspect, right? This loyalty was to be nurtured of full commitment, not fear, right? It had to be apparently positive to all involved, right? Because otherwise, the king would have sort of simply bent somebody's, spent resources to curb people that he had not been able to convince for something that had to be self-evident, just as God. The king would essentially extend an invitation, appeal for support, or the princess would propose an action of some sort. In any case, no notion of duty or impersonal service quite existed. Don't get me wrong, we've seen how, also in the video about the Merovingian army organization, how, of course, there was a great deal of this, but, for example, towards the Roman communities that in part were quite autonomous themselves, but had known better in the Roman state that sense of, okay, you have to send troops because it's the state really says that, and everything sort of crumbles at that public level during the early Middle Ages, but does not disappear, right? In theory, the Merovingian ruler controlled literally everything as a private possession, in very crude terms. But the greater, the reason, if you think especially about probably the migration here, that before the crisis of the second half of the 6th century, the plague of Justinian, etc., this territories, even though not controlled in such a capillary, direct way, were enormous, right? The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Franks controlled immense territories compared to the polities that, even though more powerful, would have existed centuries later. They were all fragmented in the same regions, by the way. That should be also explained politically and historically, because, of course, there was some standard, evidently that was not met anymore, not to be so convincing. Think about the collapse followed after the Carolingian Empire, right? But still, that sense that a strong personalized relationship characterized by command and obedience was the truest understanding of loyalty, essentially accepting that this, at least among noblemen, this is obvious to be bear in mind, that there were slaves, this was not like, again, everybody had to be free, no, right? But those who were seen as, were respected in the degree by which they bore arms. This in times was inherited by even very humble communities, that eventually developed their own autonomy within the empire, within other kingdoms. The most important thing being this: if you were a freeman, meaning that you could bear arms, you contained some divinity and nobility. This is true even for some commoners later on. We've seen it in the communal world, for example, in places where wealth had actually been quite high per capita and evenly distributed, like in the Italic kingdom. So actually you find this paradox that those people, by some, not just Germanic, but Roman standard, were living more freely in places coming from Germany or Scandinavia, right? That, as we explained, actually sort of failed more quickly under some sort of privatistic government, some lordly sense, where the peasantry was under somebody else, where basically that's all what existed. The same towns did not really have much power behind their city walls, and that really depended on the stage of civilizational development that only very gradually and difficultly in general was happening pre-industrial world, with such a great gap between the various areas of Europe. But the concept that a free personality served as the foundational basis for every unity and hierarchy was truly this Nordic hallmark, from which eventually the feudal regime would emerge, right, providing the groundwork for the old but also renewed, if you want, imperial idea. In many ways, the comitatus ethos, the Fiannes ethos, the warband ethos, is at the root of the new order to be. This is really what we owe to the Germans at a deep sort of individual level, right? The idea that the development leading to this regime begins with the alignment of the idea of the king with that of the leader of action, of war, something that takes place that is also aimed at augmenting further power, right? The king himself is the medium, again, just like the emperor had been. This is unprecedented in scale for what the Germans had done prior, right? So it's also something incredibly inspiring to them, and it really embodies the unity of the group even in times of peace. This system remains militarized, right? Even if Western Europe did not really have enormous invasions to curb, just the only one was basically like the Arabs in the West. The Visigoths even succumbed, and later we have the second invasions, but it's especially in early medieval times, the system had been cooling off a little bit and sort of restructuring, but still this had the moral standards to do so in essentially a militarized fashion, in a way in which the freemen bore arms as a distinction of status. And through different value of the individual, surely, not everybody's equal at all, right? Liberty is more inherent in this capacity to bear arms that grants the cohesion of the people. This unity can be achieved through a strengthening and extension of the warrior principle of loyalty into peaceful life. The Germans had known more closely in their more warlike societies what was the actual worth of a man, and this, psychologically speaking, also connecting you more directly to the hardships of life, also psychophysically in combat, in this say unforgiving environment, and the general primitivity of the system, makes you see way more clearly for a while, then people start forgetting it, how things are worth. Think about it. When there is something going wrong in your life, you say, oh my god, now we'll do everything well, and then things turn out better and you sort of relax a little bit. But you can see in Latin Germanic Europe this form taking shape. militarily speaking. We'll talk more about these people as also in the historical military units, etc. But think about the fideles, the faithful, the retinue, the following of a king. You have the Norse Uskarlar, you have the Longbird Gazindi, the Gothic Gardingi and Palatini, the Frankish Antrustiones or Conviva Regis. Among other terms, this also vary over time. The etymologies being also varied but similar. For example, Uskarlar is man of the house. Gazindis come from probably comrade. The Gardingas from the guards, from probably the gates. Palatinus from the palace. You see the Goths, how they were actually more hierarchical because of the Roman influence. They had palaces, they had gates. These were truly, the sort of more, let's say, civilized before the big crack also of the mid-6th century. The Franks have these antrustiones that has to do with the trustes, with the idea probably of the moral bond. Convive regis means like those who sit at the same, who live together literally with the king. So they basically all mean the same, right? This shows you how sort of this is the mob essentially, like those ties in the absence of state that establish themselves among communities to rely on one another. And so on this power that is not dependent on some external force, but is really in your hand. Naturally, these were more than freemen. These were truly, say, some of probably the top people, that many of which may have been also poorer initially, but that of course were rewarded, as we've seen, by their lords, and had a bit like the task of spending the wealth, also administrating possessions for the lord, etc., and being the guys that transformed themselves also into the heavily armored mounted force that really starts dominating the battlefields at this point in history. The hero throughout all the Indo-European epos, even among the Germans, that were the people that made, at least in the West, the least use of cavalry, had always maintained that. Right, you find it in all European mythologies. The horse is central, even to non-nomadic peoples, because the Westerners maintain, with their tribal background in antiquity, their full understanding, also in times of empires and kingdoms, the meaning, the value of the actual origin. This is something, it's a miracle that repeats itself. It's something that still lives in our veins. Still today. My surname comes from essentially the same one of Berserker, right? So that actually hits hard, I must say. So this liberty, as we've seen, exists in parallel with the service to their lord. You see that they're not antithetic. Of course, these people are less powerful individually, less free individually, if you want, than the Lord, especially in front of God, but in this earthly reflection. What they are doing is recognizing such superiority by defending the Lord's honor and rights as a privilege and as a means of achieving a higher existence than what they had previously experienced. Right, so this left them ultimately as feeling like mere beginnings and ends in themselves, because this is truly the Catholic condition of humans, right? They were so sensitive to the idea that the world can collapse under the forces of the darkness, that they understood that the only way to improve it was as a moral imperative, was to follow those who were superior, so they could be grown within this liberty that was offered to them, this obedience, but at the same time like autonomy, that could elevate them to a new condition in front of God, right? And therefore following as a trail, like this greater leaders, these greater duces, that would bring them to victory. It's extremely important. Also, the fact that in Latin, the prevalent term was dux, right, as the leader of these also provincial forces, essentially, as opposed to the more Romanized comes that is typical of more of the Frankish area. But for example, the Goths, the Longobards, etc., were normally known as duces, like in their leadership. Aside from the kings, of course, that already existed, but as this also subgroups like that would stem from the various clans, more or less extended communities within the same. Consider that down the line, the single families were expected also to sustain themselves, at least as they were in the Barbaricum, as far as everything was concerned in their food, their armament. This continued when, of course, the Germans settled down and they had to control, like also as military garrisons, the newly acquired territories that for a while were sort of still turbulent, right? So everything was based on this bond. The later feudal constitution that emerges from this system is essentially just a gradual extension to such principle. This, if you want, the greater application of this definitely appeared among the Franks. Again, the Goths had sort of a different balance. The Franks were properly in between Latinity and Germanicity, right? The Goths were more like properly into a Roman world. They saw things more civilly and urbanly, in spite of the fact that they had received also a hell of a, steppe influence, and so lordly steppe autocracy to a degree. The Franks were also a bit more, say, sheltered to an extent, but again, this is not the video to talk about these differences, but truly, again, the Franks meet this between in a way that other peoples hardly do, right? And that maybe the Longobards to an extent, but in another model. In fact, it comes to be complementary between France and Italy in so many ways throughout the entire Middle Ages as a sort of axis even. The same is true for Germany as well. This trio is a bit the magic one that makes also the Carolingian Empire, and I can't stress it enough, right? Also in the later Renovatio Imperii, of course, the Holy Roman Empire. So there is a last aspect that I would like to stress here. What's the miracle we're talking about? Because as we've seen, it's a huge deal that the Germans have this enlightenment, spiritually speaking. They managed to exploit their best to elevate themselves to an unprecedented condition. They had never really enjoyed that level of power, if not before, like at the time of the Indo-European conquest. But again, those had been sort of the rulers getting the worst let, right, in the coldest, the harshest places. Again, the Dorians, the Italics had somewhat succeeded to a greater extent. That's why they were so optimistic and so initially successful in these empires and more. The Germans arrive fairly late, but they have this enormous capacity of sitting in this reinvigoration and molding it in the way we know it in a broader Frankish sense, in this Latin Germanic, again, world that encompasses also others, right, and part of the Slavic one, for example. Frankish, as we know, is feudalism, is the vassalic beneficiary system, is what the Franks foster also as military clienteles with actually an incredible disproportion of wealth, signifying this balance that those who were elite were hyper-elite. Also in a virtuous sense, mirrored that by handling the sheer amount of power and wealth. And so, as you know, in the Frankish world, we have the most neatly delineation of this mechanism, this clientelary system that contemplated the assignment of conquered lands precisely as fiefs, as sort of prepaid wealth to that entailed like this military service, like commitment to loyalty to those who had entrusted it to you, because in theory everything, remember, depended on the leader, on the king, on the Merovingian king, Carolingian king, that sacred blood that watched over the entire system. And so that in theory all the Franks at least, but we will see beyond, because the Franks were, since Clovis, really an empire control. In fact, what is also important as far as the Imperial Catholic tradition is concerned is that while the Franks are truly the winning people that dominates over the Aquitanians, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Thuringians, etc., the scope, the breadth of their power was truly imperial in kind. The Franks were above all the others, except the Longobards, that they actually associate the crown to, like in Charlemagne himself. But their power was over all this territory and beyond, up to Spain, up to the Slavs, up to the Avars, right? And so the sense is that, as we very well know, so from some videos I made on the French nobility since Merovingian times, is that the Frankish leadership spread, right? Literally, also in a biological sense, forming a sort of connective and unifying element. It turns out that we all descend from Charlemagne. And in Europe, at least, that's kind of obvious, if at least mathematically accept that certain statistic likelihood. So it went far beyond a merely administrative system. Yes, it was very well regulated materially, like the Carolingian Empire was really a major feat of organization. Charlemagne especially was a great organizer, logistician, and other than just a great commander. What happens here is that, of course, things take a step further, because it's from this Carolingian expansion that the system truly evolves into feudalism, and also in this broader European sense, especially in the post-Carolingian world. So lordship definitely appears now to be conditioned. There is a condition. If anything, it's all the same metaphysically, but there is a greater standardization in the proceedings. There's a royal benefit that entails loyalty and service. We can document it more. It's like there is more written stuff. The major monarchies in Europe will develop in France and England, in Castile and Sicily, exactly from this model. However, when you look at still again the metaphysical situation, the metaphysical balance, what you realize that this feudal regime wasn't really that rigid at all, right? It was still founded on the same principle of dynamic assessment of traditionally understood autonomous forces, held, if anything, by an overarching idea of an organic law or of order that allowed them to exist in the first place. So way beyond the mental abomination of everybody's free, we do what we want. No, it's not really that, right? Or we're all equal, or we just all are all owed this. No. This actually is an incredibly tough time in history, but it reflects exactly the worth of people in an incredibly ranged way. Right? There are still slaves in the Carolingian era, and say the entire social segmentation, as you know, widens dramatically. At least there is an increasing gap between the elite and the rest. But this elite was truly loaded in that sense of liberty as capacity to maintain that actual power, right? There is also a contrast between these elites, exactly because they were so autonomous and so powerful at the same time. So we know very well what, especially the post-Carolingian world really was. as these forces began to fight also within the system against one another. But this is what toughened them up, right? Liberty, honor, glory, destiny, property was all based not on some sort of external sense of, okay, somebody will take care of that while we sit here waiting. No. Everything was founded on value and personal factors. There was a collective Catholic dimension, but the sense of public power or abstract laws were literally in the hands of people. They existed. Public power was never eliminated. It was needed. The same goes for laws. They were always in force, and actually it were still the laws of the ancient Germanic peoples that had drafted them after the sedentarization in the Roman world. But these applied to the extent someone was worthy of them, because also the principle of individual worth was maintained. It's not like today where everybody has the same worth just by default, right? We do this not just because we have a great central power, and this derives from also the fact that we actually give it to it, but also because we think that for how fallen we are as a people, if we don't give this trust, everything would fall even further. At the time, this power had to be properly put together, as we've seen, during the Renovatio Imperii, and as such, nobody could simply fake the fact that people were all equal, and for what purpose, right? There is no reason, right? None of us is equal. We can be equal, let's say, in the potential, in the opportunity of what we can do by divine standard, but we're definitely not equal in act, and nobody comes to be. So when you look at the world that stemmed from the Germanic reinvigoration of the Roman tradition, you realize that the hallmark of such order was authority and dignity at the same time. These were also, in fact, Roman virtues that were properly seated at the root of law, of how power was conceived, and it really manifested in society, right? Surely this world was very turbulent. Warfare is always out there, but it's from this very warfare, and we know that well as military historian, especially I like very much the 10th century because it shows how resilient the system actually was, how the Romano-Germanic world really managed to simply, say, wake up after some restoring sleep, and eventually boom, literally in the following centuries. Actually, there had been a Carolingian Empire that was already this, epic waking up, but it had also lasted just so long. But it was really incarnating that sense of relentless energy being spent. It's like Charlemagne's born under the sign of the Aries, really this sense of spring, of rejuvenation, of virginal force that spreads again like the ancient war bands of the Indo-European conquerors, and that molds the world truly at the root of its own identity. That's why we say, with some distinction of course, but in a right way figuratively, as Charlemagne, father of Europe. It's a deep idea. Like if you live in Europe, you have traveled here, you know the history, you spend your life learning about it. You know exactly how vivid, how undead and perennial such character is. It may fade like everything, but it's a force that historically has regenerated itself so many times from the same blood and soil, from this single most strictly somatic and concrete forces. It's inherent. You can feel this force within us. And it comes from an incredibly violent history, right? There is a clear differentiation of energies in it. Perhaps never before has man been treated more harshly than under the feudal regime. This is debatable. I think that actually ancient times were much more primitive and concretely regulated situation. But there is definitely something rejuvenating and transfiguring and revivifying in this meeting between the Latin and the Germanic culture that had in itself been quite violent at the beginning, but also quite cooperative also at the beginning. We'll talk more about, for example, the Germans in the Roman army. It's not just in late antiquity, but way before, by the way. So the idea of you being able to safeguard your rights and prestige, right, having the actual power to do so, is definitely fostering independence, virility, right, and not just in you, but in all those who follow you. You're not ruling over people to oppress them, you're ruling them in order to make the entire system expand. And so people to imitate you and see what power manifest really is. If you go in the post-Carolingian history playlist, you will find plenty of this stuff. There's the video about Gerald of Aurillac and secular holiness that actually explains that rather well. But we will obviously come back on the topic. And so when you think this relationship of loyalty and honor that you can find in the Heliand, Christian retinue, right? Christ as a comitatus leader, right, and with his apostles as the antrustiones. You really look at how more than in any other era of the West, starting from these times, such values were high. How much in the Middle Ages, in all those battles and wars and forces that we see at play, the sense that everything was held by this undying sense of honor and worth and power and actual responsibility and virility and great sense of dependency on the great on the lesser by on the greater, but also the other way around, because without the laboratores the bellatores would have not had their own thing, and if you don't teach them how into holy war by the oratores, etc., like, you cannot really have the system. There is always a trinity at play. Today we don't talk about that, we'll talk about it some other time. But I think there is an immense sense of accomplishment and vision in realizing how the Germanic ethnos managed to infuse all this across Europe from his incredibly tough background, also its shortcomings, but within the same, managing to rejuvenate itself and to bring Europe to the peaks of the Universal Empire, of the Hohenstaufen, for example, and displaying a level of power that for the last time was in fact described as the Sol Invictus. Yes, under Frederick II. And for telling you how traditional and original this was, and what an effort these people made in order to achieve this result. How much blood was shed, how much tears on top of it, the sense of suffering and difficulty and brutality, the horrifying world for however it was accepted and contemplated and lived in a way that today we can't quite anymore, right? This enormous force was infused for us to be better. And this is what actually our ancestors wanted from us. We largely failed them, but they also failed their ancestors to some degree. Not entirely though, and this is valid for the both of us. And I hope that videos like this can help to revive such distinction and such responsibility, such sense of ourselves in front of God and the Imperial Catholic tradition. We'll talk more about this, of course, over time. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.